What's going on, people? Today we're going to go over the basics that you need to understand the shoulder. Now, first things first, when people say the shoulder, they talk about the shoulder. Oftentimes they think about the shoulder as this joint right here, ball and socket. But the shoulder is not a joint. The shoulder is a complex that consists of at least 3 bones minimum. And those 3 bones are the shoulder blade, also known as the scapula, okay? The humerus, also known as the upper arm, okay? And the collarbone, right here, also known as the clavicle. So at minimum, the shoulder consists of 3 bones: collarbone, scapula or shoulder blade, and upper arm. And I say at minimum because I really like to include, at least from a conceptual standpoint, the fact that all of these 3 bones sit on top of all these other bones called the rib cage. So the rib cage is going to be very important, and the shape of the rib cage is going to be very important to understand when we're talking about shoulder blade motion. Because if these 3 bones, collarbone, shoulder blade, and upper arm, are the train that is moving, these are the tracks on top of which those bones move. And so the tracks guide the train. The train is subject to the structure and the direction of the tracks. And so we need to understand both the tracks and the train to understand that this is a complex and that its motion is probably much more complicated than almost any other joint or group of joints in the body. Okay? So in the shoulder, we have some basic motions. And really, when I say shoulder now, what I'm referring to is, in this case, just motion between these 2 bones right here. And so we'll talk about the sort of integration, the whole scapular-humeral rhythm thing in just a second. And again, I'll go over this quickly and sort of briefly because I just want this video to serve as an introduction. So this joint right here, again, the 2 bones that I'm touching right now, the articulations that are moving relative to one another here, this is the glenohumeral joint. This is called the glenoid, and this is the humerus, therefore glenohumeral joint. In the glenohumeral joint, we have, at least in some ways, an infinite possibility of movement. And I don't mean infinite range, but I just mean that given this structure, you can see it's kind of like a golf ball on a tee, how shallow this thing is. This thing can move all over the place, right? So this thing can move this way, it 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 can move anywhere in between those points, and it can also rotate all over the place, okay? And when we look at the shoulder and those motions, we think of really 3 directions total, in terms of like what people refer to as the cardinal planes. And within those directions, you sort of basically have 2 options within each direction. So here's what I mean. So here's a direction, right? Side to side is a direction. But when we observe this motion, we call it abduction, abduction, like an alien is abducting you. That's how I remember it. You're being taken away from the body. And this is adduction, right? So see what I mean there? Single direction, right? Single, what we would call plane. But in one sense, we call it abduction, taking the arm away. And in another, we call it adduction, adduction. Now, when we do that same thing, but basically just forward and backward, again, single plane, single sort of slot direction, we call motion of the arm forward, flexion, and motion of the arm backward, extension, right? So extension, flexion so far, abduction, taking away, adduction, moving toward. And then the last direction or slot is the rotation. So this is internal rotation. You can think of like the front of this turning inward toward the socket, and then external rotation, turning the socket away, or turning the humerus away from the socket, right? And so on me, that would look like, if my arm were bent, external rotation, internal rotation, right? If my arm were straight, external rotation, biceps to you, internal rotation, biceps sort of behind me, okay? So 3 major slots, right? And we have, again, flexion, extension, abduction, adduction, external rotation, internal rotation. And when we combine those motions, we have all these different options, right? Where if I go like this with my arm, it's called circumduction. Technically, I'm making a circle. Circumduction is a combination of all those things. I'm rotating, I'm moving forward, I'm moving backward, I'm moving up, and I'm moving down. And so the shoulder girdle is so cool because it can do all those things. And so we not only have to consider motion between these 2 bones, but now also between these 2 bones and this one. So what do we have here? Well, first off, we can slide this upward right? And sliding of this thing upward is called elevation. That's like a shrug. Okay. We have the opposite of that, which is depression, right? Many of you have probably heard of like depression, like squeeze your lats down, depress them. That is motion of the shoulder girdle downward. We have retraction, which many of you have undoubtedly heard of, which is motion of the whole shoulder girdle backward. And then we have protraction, which is the opposite of that. Okay. So elevation, depression, retraction, everything goes back. Protraction, everything goes forward. And then the last category, I would say, the last major one, is motion of, really refers to this one commonly, but when we talk about what we're going to talk about, we have to talk about all the bones, which is upward and downward rotation, okay? So upward rotation, just first, is when, just think about it from the perspective of this socket. Upward rotation is when this socket rotates upward to the sky, okay? And it doesn't necessarily have to be the sky, because I could be laying down and moving my arm. But just as a reference point for now, it's when this thing tips upward toward the sky, upward rotation. And then when this thing rotates downward, downward rotation, okay? But the reason that I say that we can't just look at the shoulder blade is because when our arm raises up overhead, in order to upwardly rotate, what also has to move, right? You all see how that clavicle, maybe you don't, right? From this perspective, it might be a little more clear. If I shift all these things, upward like this, right? My clavicle, watch my clavicle right here. It has to shift upward with that shoulder blade. And so again, the clavicle and the scapula, the shoulder blade and the upper arm, they all sort of move together. So if I'm raising my arm, the shoulder blade has to upwardly rotate along with the clavicle. Again, see that clavicle there. And if I move my arm inward toward my body, now I'm downwardly rotating, right? And the clavicle is moving downward with that shoulder blade. So you can see that the collective motion of these three bones is more complicated, but in any case, a simple rule of thumb is to remember that they're always going to move together in a similar direction. So even if you don't remember the jargon and you don't understand the sort of terminology, that's totally fine. It's much more important to me from a teaching perspective that you all understand that when the arm moves up, shoulder blade and collarbone have to move up. When the arm moves back behind the body, shoulder blade and collarbone have to move back. When the arm moves forward and across the body, shoulder blade and collarbone have to move forward and across. And when I shrug up, my upper arm, collarbone, everything moves up. When I shrug down, or I anti-shrug, everything moves down. And so can there be some independent motion like we discussed earlier of like, okay, I can just rotate the arm or I can just raise the arm to a certain point before this stuff starts to move? Yes, but from at least a force perspective, anytime you move any one of these three bones, all of them are experiencing force to some degree. So I hope this was a helpful and simple introduction to the shoulder girdle. Again, collarbone, shoulder blade, upper arm, as well as the rib cage, the train, and the tracts. And I hope that from a motion perspective, things were a little bit easier here to see. Please let me know in the comments, if you've made it this far, thank you, what you would like to see about the shoulder girdle next and what direction I should go with additional videos in the future in terms of what you all want to understand more of when it comes to these basic motions and these basic structures of the shoulder complex.